Hi, this is Noodler, and right now it's controlling and sequencing 4 external instruments. But it doesn't look or work like any sequencer I've ever seen. If I had to simplify it, with most sequencers you enter notes and out comes an idea. With Noodler, you play or enter an idea and it takes care of the notes. In this video, I'll take a look at its features in depth and explore the trade-offs between traditional sequencing and the way noodling with Noodler works. Let's get started. Now, just a little preview, at the end of this video I'll be showing you a jam with Noodler and real live synths, but to keep things simple and to help with visualizing what's going on within Noodler, I'll be using software synths throughout most of this review. I'll begin by explaining what I mean by noodling with an idea that generates notes, rather than vice versa. An idea starts with a key or mode to set the overall feel of your performance. Now, while you can change these in real time, as long as you don't, any notes Noodler produces will always stick to that key, mode, and chord that you choose unless you specifically tell it not to. Noodler can control up to 4 simultaneously playing parts: a drone part, which plays notes around the root of the scale or chord, a pad part, which plays or strums multiple notes of the chord you choose polyphonically, and 2 motif parts, which can independently play sequences or arpeggios. Noodler can be used with hardware synths, as I'll show you later on, software synths, an iPad, or any combination of the above, using its 2 MIDI outputs with MIDI over USB as well in 4 different ports. Okay, let's look at the user interface overall. Now, it would be easier to understand the basics of what's going on if you just ignore the labels to the extreme left and to the extreme right. To simplify it, let's just start by looking at the center. Once I've selected my key and mode, the main buttons around the screen play the degrees of that key and scale. By default it plays triads, but if I shift select as per the labels in here, I can play a sus2 chord, a 7th chord, and back to triad. These are the play and pause buttons for the individual parts, so I can choose, say, to start my piano part here, or the synth part over here, right? Or just start them all together, pressing play all. In this case, I've chosen drones to start only when I press a key, right? And then stop all will stop everything. The 8 encoders on the sides control the various parameters relating either to the individual parts, so for the motifs, for the pad, for the drone, and then general scale selection. That's in the main screen, and when you go into any one of the menus, then the encoders relate more or less to the parameter that's the closest to them. So if I wanted to change this parameter, I would turn this encoder. On this main screen, each encoder can control either 2 or 3 parameters. These 8 triangles on screen help you figure out which of the parameters each of the encoders is controlling. So for example, if I wanted to control position, which is the top parameter, I'd make sure that this arrow is pointing up, and then I could move the piano around. If I tap this button, this encoder, now we're controlling the pattern length. Right, same goes here. If I wanted to control clock divider, notice the arrow is pointing down now. I'd need to press the encoder, and now I can control the clock division. For the encoders or buttons with 3 parameters, you're controlling the parameter in the middle when the arrow is pointing sideways. So now I'll control the rhythm, this controls the offset, and arrow pointing up means I'm controlling the accent. Generally speaking, on screen, whatever is in yellow is being controlled by the encoders. So right now I'm controlling motif number 1. You'll notice motif 1 is yellow. If I press this button to toggle and control motif 2 will be in yellow. Then finally, this section on the bottom here tells you which chord you're playing, and the degree that you're playing. If it's in uppercase, the I, then it's a major chord, which is obviously for degree 1 of C major. That's correct. Go to degree 2, it's in lowercase, which means this is D minor. The type of chord is mentioned here, and like I said before, if I want to change the type, I first hit Shift and the type, it turns blue, and the next chord I play will be with the new type. One more thing about the main screen layout, if you look at this section in the middle, it will change based on the context. So if I'm editing a drone, you'll see drone parameters here. If I'm editing a pad, you'll see the pad parameters here, and same for the motifs. Okay, so that's the core function. Like I said, ignore these on the side for now. Let's talk about the individual parts and what makes them special. So let's start with the drone, which is the simplest part in Noodler. Notice as I toggle the different parameters, they change color, turn into yellow. The 3 options here are the octave that the drone plays in. All right, so I can change that. And then it can also play 2 notes, the current note and an octave above, and also play any combination of the 5th and the root. Then below here you can choose the trigger and the way that the drone plays. So it will either stick to the root note of the scale, regardless of how we change the degree. And then we can have it have different rhythms. Right? And then if we keep moving in this play turns into dots, then it will transpose along with the chord. And there are the various rhythmic options here too. Next up in complexity is the pad. The pad part can play anywhere from 1 to many more notes. You can control its position. And there are a few different types of spread as well. I'll just play through these a bit to give you a taste of what they sound and look like. This one's quite interesting. It spreads the notes apart more for the lower notes than the higher ones, so that your bottom end doesn't get too muddy. And this of course changes based on the chord, right? And if you want a lot of notes in your pad, you can certainly make that happen. So get your synth's polyphony ready for this one. And because it can play so many notes, you also have an option to spread these notes across up to 4 different synths with a polychaining feature. Another nice option here is to have notes strum, and there are a few strumming options or rates. Let's start with the basic one, right? Or slower. Right? So that is the strum feature. And if I move the number of notes down to a more reasonable number, say 4 notes, one of the nice things here is that Noodler will invert chords rather than just play them higher as you play different degrees. So this is obviously much more interesting musically than just simply transposing notes up and down. Okay, so those are drones and pads. Let's move on to the more interesting type of part, and that's the motifs. Now, there are 2 motifs. You toggle their control here. Like we mentioned before, they're completely separate and independent of each other, but identical in features. Now, motifs are really what make Noodler special. Now, they may sound like a standard arpeggiator or sequencer, but they're really quite different for a few reasons. The first is because, like everything in Noodler, they stick to the key, mode, chord, and chord type that you're playing in. And the second thing that's unique about motifs is that the notes they play, or their pattern, is programmed and kept separately than their rhythm, the beat, or the velocity and how they're played. You can have the same pattern played with completely different rhythms, or you can look at these as grooves, and vice versa. You can see a representation of the rhythm and the pattern over here. I will choose the simplest rhythm possible, just a monotonous note, and then choose the simplest pattern possible, just going up. I'll even shorten it to one note long. Right, so this is one note repeating with one rhythm, and as I increase the pattern length, you can see it starts playing that pattern. You can choose different patterns. If I go back to the original simple pattern, you can play it in different directions. Play it down, up and down, repeat the notes on the edge, odd and even, and then randomly. So up until now, everything you'd expect from a typical arpeggiator. Now, this sounds like a simple arpeggiator, but if I enter the pattern editor by hitting Shift and Menu and then pressing this button, it's already pressed, but, going over here, then this is where the magic starts to happen. There are three types of patterns. A pattern type can be a chord type, and it can also be chromatic and scale type. Now, chromatic is what you're used to with regular sequencers. With scale type, every interval represents a note in the scale, not a semitone. And then if I change the pattern note type to chord, then every interval becomes a different note in the chord. So it'll play different notes based on the chord and the chord type that you choose. So if I shorten this to something that's a little bit easier to recognize, I'll go back into the main screen and then make a simple pattern type. You'll hear that what we're playing, right, are notes in a chord. Right? So that's what those intervals represent. Not chromatic notes, not notes in a scale, but notes in the chord. Right? So those are patterns. Rhythms are how the notes are played. So let's get back into the rhythm editor. Take a look at what that sounds like. Right? So here I've got a simple 4-note rhythm and they're all the same. So they're not going to be any different. But if I shorten this, look at the value, I can change a step into a rest, or I can tie notes. Right? So now we have the same 4 notes, but playing in a completely different rhythm. Now, patterns can be up to 16 notes long, and rhythms can be up to 32 steps long, including rests and ties. And you can edit these as they play along. If you want to change levels, by the way, you can do that as well. You can change the level of each step. And like I said before, each step can be either a rest or a tie. Overall, by the way, you've got 20 preset patterns and 20 preset rhythms, and then another 20 goes up to 40 that you can program and save. Now, I obviously won't go into all the features and all the things that this can do. I'll just briefly say that there are a few rhythm options beside the levels in the programmed rhythm pattern. You can also choose a humanize function or just a few other different kinds of velocity patterns. And if you want, you can also offset the two motifs from each other in 1/8 note increments. So those are pretty much the basics of Noodler. Let's talk about a few of the settings options. There are 3 settings menus. The first will let you set the MIDI channel and output port for each of the 4 parts. There are also 2 incoming ports. You can use that just to play notes through if you've got a keyboard connected and you've got this connected to your synths. And you can also use one of the MIDI channels to control the chord and the chord type. And a really nice option, you can also set a particular channel to be transposed and scaled down to the current chord, key, and mode. This is pretty neat because it means that no matter what note you play on your keyboard, you'll always be in the same key and scale as whatever is going on inside Noodler. I'll give you a brief look at the other settings screens. There's default velocities, clock dividers, the humanize function I talked about before, and a few other global settings. You can save, by the way, the entire state of the machine into one of 8 different global save slots. The final advanced feature that I want to talk about are the LFOs and the 8 mod matrix slots. You access them by pressing these buttons here. So these screens are all similar, and you choose the LFO types. You configure the LFOs over here on this screen. Now here, remember, each of the encoders controls its respective parameter. For LFO rates, you've got it either in seconds, or if you go past 40, in beats. And the reason that that's important is because the LFO shapes can be not just the simple typical shapes you'd expect from an LFO, but as you saw here before, also any one of the note patterns. Once you've got the LFO shape set, you go into any one of the LFOs, into the mod matrix. You can choose a source, right? So you can have any one of the 3 LFOs. There are a few built-in factory shapes, and then you can also use the MIDI inputs, velocity, pitch, bend, mod wheel, and so on, all that as modulation sources. There are a number of parameters that can be destinations for the LFO, and you can also obviously choose a mod depth as well. So just as an example, if I wanted to take, let's say LFO 2, and I wanted that to be a simple triangle waveform, and I'll make it a bit faster, right? And I wanted to then apply that in the mod matrix, LFO 2, to, yeah, you can do MIDI CCs as well, but I want to go to the pad position and modulate that, right? So this is our pad, and then as I increase the mod amount, you can see the LFO modulate the pad's position, and there's a nice representation of the pad's position here. And I could go ahead and play with the range or spread, right? So we covered pretty much all the features. You may have noticed that I talked about the pattern editor and the rhythm editor, but I didn't talk about the chord sequencer and the MIDI controller functionality because those haven't been implemented in this version of the firmware. The team at Noodler are pretty confident that they will. That's why they printed this on the panel, but these features aren't available now. So currently you can't sequence chords. There's a workaround. You can go into the LFOs and then use one of the patterns to change the chords and the degrees using the pattern as a mod source, and then the chord, where is that? Here we go. The chord degree and the chord type as modulation destinations. So that's a little bit of a workaround for now. Hopefully we'll get a proper chord sequencer soon. In terms of hardware build, Noodler is aluminum. It's super solid. There are 2 MIDI outs and 2 MIDI ins. There's one USB port, which is also the power, as well as transfers MIDI data to 4 virtual ports. You also have clock in and clock out. There isn't an on and off switch. The minute you plug in USB power, it turns on. The encoders feel very solid. The only issue that I have is sometimes a light touch when you press the encoder will also change the parameter. It depends on where the encoder used to be. I know this is something that they're working on as a firmware update, but overall, aside from that, things feel very solid. A hardware thing, these are pretty clicky, so as you're playing, that may or may not bother you. Maybe it's just my OCD, but I would have rather had more silent pads here. By the way, if the clickiness of the buttons really bothers you, you can always trigger chord changes using an external MIDI keyboard or controller. A few more cons in the pros and cons. There isn't currently a global gate feature. That's something you can work around in the rhythm editor though by tying notes and creating different rhythm patterns. But aside from that, if you just want a gate control, you're going to need to do that on your synth. A bit more on the hardware. The screen is very clear, but as you may be able to tell, quite small. So prepare to work at a rather close distance rather than from far away if you want to see the individual parameters on screen. So all those things said, on the pros side, Noodler is a genuinely fresh approach to live jamming and sequencing. I'm not aware of anything like it. If you're interested in a sequencer that just plays the same elaborate patterns every time from start to finish, there are other options. Noodler, as the name implies, is for jamming and noodling. You're in charge of the direction it takes rather than bothering with which specific notes it plays, which is quite liberating. It's easy to find yourself in very interesting and surprising polymetric moments of bliss or chaos depending on your point of view, and for that, there's nothing quite like this. Now, I'll be taking a deeper look into non-traditional and generative sequencing both on this channel as well as in my ever-expanding book available to people who support this channel on Patreon, so make sure to ring the bell after you subscribe and check the links below if you don't want to miss that. If you have any questions about Noodler, feel free to leave a comment below, hit like if you liked this video. Thanks very much for watching.